tonight we have Susan Lehmann. Is that pronounced correctly, Lehmann? Okay, thank you. Hails from Miami, Florida, and discovered writing and journalism while attending Florida State University. In 1981, she declined a job offer with the new CNN, thinking, who would want to watch a 24-hour news channel? Now that her path in life was determined by the idea that she would be a real journalist instead, she put her interview skills to work as a writer and publisher, all of which was sidelined when she became a mother to 3 children. In '96, inspired by her fictional heroines, Kinsey Milhone and Stephanie Plum, she opened a private investigation agency because there is no better way to distract yourself from the arduous work of writing than by dealing with cheating spouses, tracking down deadbeat parents, and sitting through interminable nighttime surveillance operations. She quickly learned that real investigative work is not nearly as exciting as the escapades of fictional detectives. Jim's phone call in 2005 led her into the field of criminal defense investigation and capital murder mitigation. To date, she has worked on 37 death penalty cases, and yes, she has made frequent visits to death row prisons. Her simultaneous professions inform her nonfiction writing, samples of which have earned her a '96 Eaton Literary Award and a 2016 Utah Original Writing Competition honorable mention in nonfiction. As a result, she delves into her wide-ranging experiences as a journalist, private investigator, and death penalty mitigation expert. There should be 1 or 2 good stories in there somewhere. What's that old saw, truth is stranger than fiction? Perhaps because the temperate climate of the South attracts crazies, her life intersected with 2 serial killers and resulted in two true crime books, Visions of Ted Bundy, The Psychic and the Chi Omega Murders, and Echoes from the Mind, The Psychic and the Gainesville Student Murders. In 2021, in response to the never-ending pandemic, she has started to re-explore an old passion as a freelance writer, working on stories in and around the Front Range of Colorado and the Rocky Mountain National Park. She lives with her husband, 2 well-loved felines, and 2 cheerful golden retrievers, Graham and Gouda. And she's currently working on her next book, Southern Lies and Homicides. So welcome, Susan. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to speak with you tonight. Some of you may wonder why I'm a member of the Mystery Writers, but I haven't yet written a whodunit. But through my work as a journalist, a private investigator, and a mitigation specialist for capital murder cases, I've certainly solved a few mysteries over the decades. I studied creative writing in college. One day, a professor I greatly admired and feared said to the class, "Some people live to write." And he smiled at several very talented students. Then he looked at me and he said, "While others are too busy living to write well." I've never forgotten that. Kind of set the tone. Okay. Fiction stymied me. I didn't have the stamina or the imagination to write it, but I published at least 1 story 5 days a week for a newspaper. I began work in a newsroom just after the Chi Omega murders in Tallahassee, Florida. I wanted a crime beat, and it took me over a year of covering county and state government and women's interest stories to finally land that crime beat. One day in November 1979, a guy came to the newsroom looking for me. He said he'd helped capture the Chi Omega killer and worked with an investigator on the task force. He'd been a person of interest himself, and later a suspect in the brutal killing of 2 co-eds and the savage beatings of 3 other young women. The guy claimed to have clairvoyant visions of the killer, and I was intrigued. The investigator, George Brands, was a captain in the Leon County Sheriff's Department. He validated the story and gave me many details, but he wouldn't go on the record unless and until Ted Bundy was executed. He was afraid he'd lose his job, and he didn't want to say anything that could assist Bundy in his appeals. The story would have to wait. 10 years passed before Ted Bundy was put to death. I'd left the newsroom, I traveled internationally, I'd gotten married, I'd had children, and I lived in Gainesville, Florida, 150 miles south of Tallahassee. Days after Bundy's 1989 execution, I called Captain Brand. I made several trips to work with George, who led the sheriff's department and was the head of security for the FSU Seminoles football team. I began writing a book about the psychic, Ted Bundy, and George Brand. I immediately found agency representation and a good editor. But writing the book was difficult. My marriage imploded during that time. I had 3 young children to support, and I worked numerous jobs to make ends meet. By 1990, I had written a solid draft of the story, but by that time, one of my agents had died, and the other didn't like my manuscript. In August 1990, that same year, my life coincided with a second serial killer, when 5 University of Florida students were brutally slain in their apartments. A chance meeting led me to another psychic, a woman who I call Rachel. She claimed at least one of the deceased female students was giving her messages about the killer. I gained Rachel's trust and brought her to the attention of a detective I knew on the hastily assembled task force. When all leads led nowhere and public approval of the handling of the murders plummeted, I received a call from an officer on the task force asking me to coordinate a meeting between investigators and the psychic, which I did. Over a several-week period, I got to accompany Rachel to the crime scene and made 2 lifelong friends, Rachel and Patricia Rogers, a special agent from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. I also came away with a hello story. In the aftermath of the student murders, Gainesville was crawling with journalists and Hollywood producers, one of whom asked me to write a full-length screenplay about the psychic working to solve the murders. A full-page article in the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel put me into the public spotlight, and members of the task force had me checking out other local psychics and filtering their information. Suffice to say, most of these psychics were outright crazies. One woman, whom I'll call Sage, covered all her mirrors with black fabric so the killer wouldn't be able to see her, and said her cat was giving her information telepathically about the killer. And that was a lot of fun. So Rachel continued working with me, as did a reluctant older woman I called Bernice. She and I found the abandoned gas station where the killer was living, and she took photographs. When I turned him over to my source at the task force, he said, "You've probably come the closest to the killer, and let's talk about it." He advised me to stay away from the area, and he didn't have to tell me twice. I wrote the screenplay, but never heard from the producer again. This foray into a high-profile criminal investigation whet my appetite to solve mysteries, and while I held regular jobs for a while, I knew I wanted to work in the investigative field, just not in law enforcement. In 1994, I married my second husband, Peter Lehmann, a wonderful man with loads of patience and a great sense of humor. Together, we raised my kids and built the life we still share. In 1996, his job relocated to Montgomery, Alabama. That spring, I submitted a new draft of Bundy's story to the Eaton Literary Awards competition, and much to my surprise, I won. Unfortunately, Eaton did not publish true crime, but they sent me a check for $2,500, which was a significant nod to my writing skills. At the time, I entered into an agreement with yet another literary agent, and he urged me to write a series of stories with a female investigator as the protagonist, like Sue Grafton and her alphabet mysteries, he said. But I wondered how I could credibly write a series of stories about a private investigator solving murders when, in fact, I hadn't solved anything. I just wrote about killers and psychics. Being private investigator had been an idea since I left the newspaper shortly after becoming a mom. Casework seemed like journalism. I thought the reporter's formula of 5W plus 1H, the who, what, when, where, why, and how rules might apply to domestic problem solving. A little research showed there were few requirements to have a professional investigator's license in Alabama. A county business license was the sole need. But how to begin? I didn't want to work alone. I was concerned about sleuthing without training. The word stalker comes to mind. I envisioned a business environment where I could draw a paycheck without the aggravation of billing, banking, taxes, and management headaches on top of performing work. I'd been self-employed before and worn all those hats. Turning to the telephone directory, I saw there were 11 private investigative agencies listed in Montgomery. I studied their yellow page ads. Most had telephone numbers but no addresses. A clue, the detectives worked from home. I quickly scuttled my plan to show up their offices, so I mustered my courage and began making phone calls. Half the numbers were out of service or disconnected. I reached several answering machines, leaving messages with little confidence of a return call. A man answered on my 8th or 9th attempt. I blended through the conversation, and the PI, whom I'll call Larry, was not much impressed with me. We're not hiring now, and especially not anyone I have to train, he said. Well, I probably don't need much training. I used to be a journalist, and I have a lot of skills, I said, such as, my mind blanked. Well, I'm good at interviewing people, gathering records, writing reports, taking photos, things like that. When was the last time you sat in a car by yourself working surveillance all night? Never. And he said, call me when you get some training. And I'm thinking to myself, listen, I've dined with a serial killer and found the hideaway of another one. That must count for something, I thought. But he had already hung up. Undaunted, research was next on my list. This was a time before Google or Amazon, so I visited the main library in Montgomery and thumbed through the card catalog looking for a how-to book. Someone must have written one. While some dealt with law enforcement, there was nothing on the nonfiction shelves that could teach me how to skip trace or run a surveillance operation. Reference librarian sprang into action, and she dutifully checked the same catalog I'd already examined. Eyebrows knit, she was puzzled and perplexed, but intent on helping. She checked drawer after drawer of index listings. She closed the last one and leaned against the cabinet for a moment. I'll be right back, she disappeared. Eventually, she returned with a huge grin and an armload of books. I think these may be helpful. One by one, she displayed her finds. 1 for the money and 2 for the dough by Janet Ivanovich. And 3 books by Sue Grafton. At the bottom of the pile were 2 novels by Dashiell Hammett, one featuring hard-boiled detective Sam Spade, another with sleuthing couple Nick and Nora Charles solving the whodunit. I loved the Hammett books in college, and the movies that were made from the stories were some of my favorites. I hadn't read the women authors, although my last literary agent wanted me to write like Grafton. I got a library card. All the books came home. I devoured them, making notes, and worked through to the endings with the characters. Stephanie Plum books were educational if you're going to be a bond enforcement agent, particularly a hapless one. I had interned briefly with a bounty hunter in Gainesville until he dropped out outside a convenience store after buying a carton of cigarettes. He was 46 but had too much stress in his life. No, that wasn't for me. The plots in these books were laugh-out-loud funny, but served as a what not to do in the field of process serving, skip tracing, and fugitive apprehension. Kinsey Milholm, the female protagonist of Sue Grafton's alphabet books, captured my heart. She was exactly the kind of PI I longed to be, but with a husband, 3 kids, a reliable car, and hopefully more money. I took notes on the techniques can be used to solve cases. I then called Larry again. He answered the phone. Look, I may not be trained, but I'm a fast learner. I said, please, do you have something I can help you with? Silence, a measurable pause, and then, come in tomorrow morning. Oh, The 9:30 was the time set. The early morning found me exhausted from a lack of sleep, my brain afire all night, burning with a million questions. Chief among them was dressing for the meeting. I was in a turmoil over an outfit because I reasoned this was a job interview. Thankfully, the kids made the bus, which allowed me to shower, style my hair, put on a little makeup in an appropriate amount of time. I had decided on the Kinsey Millham style of dress, blue jeans, a blouse, and a blazer. My sole departure was to wear leather flats rather than tennis shoes. My left arm and wrist had barely come out of the cast that I'd worn for 3 months since a dumb canoeing accident on the Coosa River that summer. I hadn't fully regained use of it because I didn't want to go to physical therapy. I was left-handed, and my 10-year-old daughter, who's right over there, had been writing checks for me at the grocery store to pay bills and sign school progress reports. Michelle had become so adept at forging my signature that it was hard to tell them apart. This proved to be a useful skill for her, and especially for the benefit of her brothers. But I digress. 30 minutes had been allotted to drive into town and find the agency, and it was a good estimate. Larry's office was located behind a strip mall in East Montgomery next to a laundromat. At exactly 9:30, I knocked on the door, which was opened by a woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s. She looked me up and down. "Are you a new client?" Explaining my appointment with Larry, she raised a carefully tweezed eyebrow. "He won't give me a raise, but he's hiring someone new." She grumbled and shuffled back to her desk with a ringing phone. "He's not here." Uh-oh. The woman ignored me, chatting away on the phone about an evening spent drinking at a local bar, trying to catch the eye of a guy. I wandered around the bare-boned office, 2 desks, a handful of mismatched chairs, a couple of battered filing cabinets, and blank walls. A dining table was pushed against a back wall. Film cameras, pages, voice recorders, and a camcorder with tapes were strewn on the surface. A dead plant was the centerpiece. Half-filled soda bottles and an open bag of pretzels lay amongst the equipment. There was an old Mr. Coffee with a couple of dirty mugs. The floor of the one-room office was bare concrete. A door led to a storage closet, a set of golf clubs, and a man's shoes and clothing inside. The office did not have a bathroom or a kitchen. At 10 o'clock, I prepared to leave. The woman continued with the phone call. The door opened, and she slammed down the receiver. "Go clean out my car," he said to the woman, whose name was Jennifer. "There are bottles in there. Go get them out." She groaned and shuffled from her desk, slamming the door behind her. I was to learn that Larry urinated into empty soda bottles while working. He shared this tip with me while explaining why women were badly suited to PI work. You can't pee in a bottle, he said to me. You have to leave your post to find the bathroom, so women fail at surveillance every time, he was fond of saying. Larry was not a tall man, but he was thick-necked and muscle-bound. He was in his late 40s, clean-shaven with a crew cut. He was a competitive bodybuilder and spent his off-hours training. Over several months, Larry taught me spycraft, like the basics of surveillance, and how to trail subjects without getting caught. He specialized in workers' compensation and cheating spouse investigations. I learned how to eavesdrop on cordless phone conversations between lovers with a Bearcat analog scanner. I can't find those anymore. He'd let the air out of car tires in the middle of the night and return the next morning to videotape the injured person changing the flattened tire. Some nights he forwarded the business calls to my home phone. Callers often awakened me many hours after midnight, wanting case updates or looking to hire a PI. Some of these people were lonely, seeking conversation. After a month or so, I began to spot a pattern in Larry's behavior. For 2 weeks, Larry was fun to work with. He made jokes and our interactions were companionable. Before long, I had my own cases. But I was never allowed to meet clients or speak with them. I was contracted and paid $10 an hour plus mileage. I was doing decent work and the weekly checks were welcome. By the 3rd week of the cycle, Larry became moody, agitated, and quick to anger. He found fault with Jennifer and with me, often making cutting remarks. Jennifer would cry at her desk. Larry was cycling steroids. She confided in a rare moment of friendliness. She never came into the office during the 4th weeks. I answered calls, took messages, and did little else. Legal secretaries called often wanting to know the status of court documents they'd sent to Larry for service. I found a bulging file folder stuffed with subpoenas and summons and complaints. Some had lapsed dates. I offered to help him with these, try to serve the papers. But Larry said those were his bread and butter, and he was worried I'd take the business away from him. The next time I was alone, I jotted down the names of the attorneys and their paralegals, just in case. One day, Larry demanded I empty the bottles from his car. I picked up my purse and keys and left for the day. Curious, I conducted a mini investigation. Larry was day trading in the stock market. He was lousy at it and often overdrafted his bank account. When he contracted a cheating spouse or custody case, he would get a client's credit card number and expiration date. He'd bill a retainer and subsequent charges. That information was written inside a client's folder. I often worked on several cases during a week, assigned my hours and mileage to a client, and submitted my billing reports every Thursday afternoon. Fridays were paydays. One afternoon during 4th week, Larry was out of town following a philandering husband. Bored, I pulled out case files to read. The folders contained my reports, photographs, and other case evidence. I scanned the invoices Jennifer prepared for clients. I earned $10 an hour, but the clients were being billed at rates of $40 or $50 an hour. Larry was the boss. It was his agency. He had to make a living. I understood them. But attached to my billing were yellow sticky notes instructing Jennifer to inflate the number of billable hours. If I had logged 10 hours on a case, he told her to double or even triple the number of hours on an invoice. A $100 fee could turn into a $1,000 charge. Larry would mail invoices to these clients. He would call them and request more money, or he'd run their credit cards without permission. Twice I fielded calls from angry clients who had thousands of dollars in charges appear on their statements. Once I overheard Larry talking with an irate client about billing errors made by his investigator. He was blaming me for his fraudulent activities. That Friday, at the end of that 4th week, I got my paycheck and walked out. I never returned to that office, and it would be a decade before I saw Larry again. I learned enough. It was time to go into business for myself. The years flew by. What had begun as research turned into a profession. I served papers all over Alabama and into Georgia, making connections with attorneys. I worked custody and divorce cases. I found missing people. I gathered records for lawsuits. I even cracked a corporate embezzlement case. The thief was the woman with the cats. The evidence was found in her garbage, along with the kitty litter. 2005 found me burned out and exhausted. My clients were typically well-heeled enough to hire me on top of legal fees. I didn't like many of the people I worked for. I found them privileged and annoying. My mother had died that year from complications of dementia, a grueling disease for bystanders. My middle child, Danny, was in the Army infantry stationed in Germany, about to be shipped to Iraq. My heart was heavy, and I simply didn't want to be bothered by people and their problems anymore. I wanted to write, and I needed to heal myself. After settling my mother's affairs, Peter took me to Vermont and Montreal for a long vacation. I decided to close my business, a hard decision because much of my identity comes from my profession. Late in the trip, I received a phone call from a large corporate firm in Birmingham. There were a group of attorneys working on a project, and they needed someone to gather records. Was I interested? I decided one last shot of work would be okay, and we arranged a time for me to come to Birmingham to meet with the team. Little did I know at the time that that meeting changed my life. The assembled attorneys were from Palo Alto, California, Washington, D.C., and the offices of Bradley Arant Bolt Cummings, a large national corporate firm. They were working on behalf of Melvin Davis, a black man from Montgomery who sat on death row, convicted of committing a double murder in 1996. The goal of the pro bono team was to either get a new trial for Davis or new sentencing, which could remove the death penalty. I was fascinated by these men and women dedicated to providing legal assistance to a man who had been failed by his court-appointed attorneys. They gave me a list of records they needed, and I went to work. The records were easy to obtain. As I knocked out the task, I was assigned more. Records led to interviews, and soon I was working with Melvin's mother, his brother, other relatives, girlfriends, and associates to gather medical education and criminal records to build a case chronology of events that led to the night of the murders. I gathered every shred of his history because the goal was to show how his original attorneys had failed Melvin by not presenting mitigating evidence and testimony at the sentencing phase of his trial. Loved ones should have spoken on his behalf. Someone should have explained to jurors why his life mattered. 5W plus 1H. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. The reporter's formula worked for investigators as well. With my oldest son, Jacob, who pieced together the daily crime statistics from microfilm from the time frame of the murders, we discovered a game the Montgomery Police Department had been playing with neighborhood crime figures. They periodically renumbered districts to trick people into thinking some areas had become safer through diligent police work, while others had become more unstable. The area where Melvin and his family lived was crime and drug riddled for years, no matter what number it was assigned. No amount of federal money could change the situation. I was stonewalled from gathering information from the MPD, but armed with a subpoena, the records were eventually turned over to our attorneys. But the practice continued. Federal money flowed into the MPD crime-fighting coffers, but the area remained blighted. Psychological and social work experts, family and friends testified at Melvin's hearing to convince the judge errors had been made by his original trial attorneys. Despite the diligent work and compelling arguments, Melvin remains on death row. That case marked a turning point in my life. From 2005 through 2020, I worked on 37 capital murder cases. Half of my clients were facing trials with the possibility of a death sentence, and others awaited a death warrant. My clients and their families were not entitled or affluent. They were the poorest of the poor. From the margins of society, saddled with every imaginable cultural affliction, including generational poverty, addiction, untreated familial mental illness, and a lack of education and work skills. These are people who struggle with daily life. My clients were poor historians. They rarely understood how their lives differ from most mainstream Americans. My client and friend Robert Butts in Milledgeville, Georgia, believed his upbringing was normal. I learned through 2 years of interviews and record gathering that he had the worst childhood of any of my clients. His grandmother, aunts, uncles, teachers, and social workers were all aware of the perilous situations Robert faced daily. From a very young age, yet all turned a blind eye to the little boy raising his brothers alone in a trailer. His druggy mother often missing for weeks at a time. Grandma would drop off a bag of groceries every several days. No one showed the boy a better way. No one protected the little boy who became a young man on death row. Perhaps Robert was doomed from birth. Somebody actually said that about him. Yet somehow in his confinement, he built a life. He taught himself how to draw and write poetry. He published a book of his work with the help of pen pals from all over the world. He never forgot my birthday, and he was executed in 2018. I learned through this work that I have no problems that cannot be overcome. In 2016, while living in Utah, nearing the end of my casework, a friend mentioned the Utah Original Writing Competition. The deadline was fast approaching, and she suggested I submit something. I dusted off the screenplay from the Gainesville student murders that I called Echoes from the Mind, and thought it would be good to submit. But there was no category for screenplays, so I spent 2 weeks turning it into a full-length manuscript. I entered it at the very last moment and earned an honorable mention in the nonfiction category. A note from the judge said I would have won if the manuscript had been better edited. It was just a mess. I patted myself on the back. Turning a screenplay into a full-length book in 2 weeks was no easy feat. Buoyant from this success, I decided to properly work up both manuscripts. I rewrote them from scratch, hired a professional editor, and Peter and I formed our own publishing company, White Rhino Press, to self-publish because I wanted to simply get the books finished and into print. They were on Amazon and nearly every sales platform, and I was thrilled to finally tell those tales. I'm currently working on my third book, a collection of my investigative stories titled Southern Lies and Homicide, Tales of Betrayal and Murder. And I'm working through these with the patient and talented souls in my weekly writers group, Writers on the Brink. I should be looking for an agent, but I can't seem to finish writing my proposal. Maybe that's because I'm too busy. Maybe it's that too busy living thing I do. Perhaps next year I'll write a proper mystery novel. I've got knowledge of an unsolved murder or two, and if any of you know a good psychic, please let me know. I'm ready for some more adventures. And always remember the 5 W's and 1 H. Those rules work for writing great mysteries too. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And nobody has any questions, right? Sure. Questions? How do you find a psychic? They find you. I used to look them up in the phone book.
You're kidding. You can find them on the internet.
Oh, they're on all over the place. Yeah. The problem is finding that housewife that hides in her house and, gets those visions. So that's the problem. Finding the ones that aren't in it for the money. That's the one I want to find.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
But how did the police react? I mean, did they call you? Did you say they called you when you had a psychic that was telling you about those murders? Or?
So what had happened there was, I met this woman in a bathroom after a press conference. And she was friends with some friends of mine. And it was a press conference for the Gainesville student murders. And we were both in the restroom at the same time. And I looked at her and I said, do you know something about this? And then she started, she was very timid. She was very, very timid. And she'd never worked a job in her life. She was very well taken care of by her husband. And she started crying in the bathroom. And so our mutual friend brought her to my house later that afternoon, and she laid out the story about one of the first young women who had been found in her apartment. And the details that she was giving me about a particular soap that was used, about the details about things that were arranged in the apartment. And I wrote those notes, and I said, you're telling me this, but you have to know that I'm going to take this to law enforcement. And I knew a couple of people that were on the task force at the time. One I had known from my work on the Bundy case. And I said, do I have your permission? And she said, you know, yeah. And then she wanted to talk to me some more, so she came back the next day, and she gave me more information and more details. And it just had this ring of truth to it. There was something she was saying to me that felt right, the details, the level of details. So I wrote them up, and I called a man I knew on the task force, and I said, can I bring this by? And he, you know, and he said, yeah, and I gave my notes, and I didn't hear anything. And this was an extraordinarily high profile. There were 5 dead students at the beginning of the school year. And parents were flipped out, students were flipped out, I was flipped out. Everybody was just on edge about this. And they've been chasing a guy that looked like he could have been a killer, but he wasn't. And the town was just on edge. And finally, after nothing happened, I got a call from somebody else on the task force and was asked if this woman, Rachel, would be willing to speak with them. And we arranged for a meeting at my house, and then came, and it was 2 investigators from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and one became a lifelong friend, Patricia. And that was sort of how it happened. And then all of a sudden they were like, can you check out this woman? She's sending these notes to the task force. Can you check out this one? We don't think there's anything there, but can you? And everybody else kind of just paled in comparison to Rachel and what Rachel was talking about. And I actually got to go to the crime scenes with Rachel and with investigators, but like at 2 o'clock in the morning, when they didn't think the press would be following. And we would be in the van that drove the governor around and that kind of thing, you know, with all of the surveillance and stuff. And it was pretty interesting. It was a very, very interesting time.
So they were receptive, though, to using the psychic? I would think that most police for law enforcement would realize it.
Well, no, I mean, and they didn't want it to get out.
Well, that's why it's 2 in the morning.
Yeah, they didn't want reporters catching wind of it. They didn't want other people on the task force catching wind of it. It became Pat Rogers. It became Patricia Rogers' case. And there were actually some clues that took a little while to figure out. It took them a little while to figure out. But all 3 of us, several years ago, on the anniversary of the student murders, did a book reading together in Gainesville and talked about the case and how skeptical, Pat talked about how skeptical she had been, and Rachel talked about how nervous she'd been dealing with law enforcement. Okay. So it was an interesting time. But yeah, no, I mean, there would never be any kind of a public, oh yeah, thank you to my psychic. Because it would certainly kind of make those guys look bad, wouldn't it? But yeah, there was just enough information to make it intriguing.
What was your most interesting case when you were doing your PI work here in private investment?
I had a friend, and her husband was having an affair. And it was a case I did not get paid for. It was a case that I helped her build. And we were building it for a divorce. And her husband was carrying on an affair with the neighbor. The neighbor was married also. And he had a private phone line in a separate office, and he traveled a lot. And I told her I could not do this, but I told her you could go to Radio Shack and you can buy a device that you can put in a wall plug. You remember when we used to have landlines? And you can record the phone calls. I said, I can't touch it because it's illegal if I do it, but, you know, are you part of his business? And she said, yes, I'm part of his. Okay, then you can do it. And so we always knew where her husband was meeting the girlfriend. They would go fishing together, and they would go to bars together, and they went bowling together, and they were pretty open. But the other thing, too, is so what this woman started doing was she started going through his credit cards. And she found, oh, when she thought he was working in, you know, say, Indiana, he was really in Cancun. And she was pretty clueless. I mean, this thing had been going on for a long time. And she started getting in and she started digging into the financials. And she saw, oh, you know, he's buying lingerie. Well, he's not giving that to her. She's like, I've been wearing the same Walmart underwear for 10 years. And anyway, the whole thing was really, really perplexing. And at a certain point, I said, you know, you've got enough stuff. Go get a lawyer. Gave her the name of the lawyer. Said, you know, you've got enough stuff, you got enough stuff. And he was fairly wealthy. He was making a lot of money in his business. And one weekend, he said he was going out of town on business. And she knew who he was having an affair with. And she said she was going down to the beach with some girlfriends. And so my friend went to the airport and she went to long-term parking and she saw their cars parked next to each other. His truck, her car. And then she was following all the receipts, and she became really good at piecing together the financials. And he was spending tons and tons of their marital assets on this woman. And one night, they were all having dinner, and the husband of the lover came charging into the kitchen, drunk, and my friend's husband grabbed the shotgun and shot him dead in the kitchen. That was a pretty interesting case that I never got paid for. I never charged. And so here's the kicker on the whole thing. For a divorce case, it was brilliantly put together. We had everything. We had all of the evidence to support a divorce. And she would get alimony and child kids in the house and the dogs and all of it. But when he pulled that trigger and he killed his girlfriend's husband in the kitchen in front of his kids, everything changed. She called me at 6 o'clock the next morning, Sunday morning, and she said, I need the name of a good criminal attorney.
No. Oh my God.
And he was not charged, but he was definitely, it was investigated. And they took his shotgun away from him, and he was furious because that had been his family shot, his father's shotgun, and blah, blah, blah. Well, the second that they lawyered up with the criminal defense attorney, I got a call from the criminal defense attorney who said, I need you to sign some papers and I need you to turn over all of the evidence because she admitted what we'd been doing. And there was motive. And she and her husband came the next day and picked up everything. All of the recorded phone calls, all of the photographs, all of the documentation, everything. That was the end of the case. Because with divorces, if you catch your spouse cheating, but you take your spouse back, all of the evidence disappears. All of it. You're done. And she stuck by him.
Oh, my God.
Throughout that entire investigation. I was told I couldn't talk about it. Everything was, you know, they were making it look like they had the best marriage in the world. Everything. The case went to the grand jury. The grand jury non-billed them, or whatever they call it. They found it to be a case of self-defense.
Self-defense.
Within the week, he divorced her. And he got custody of the kids, and he didn't have to pay her much in the way of alimony, just rehabilitative alimony, sent her back to college, bought her a small house. That was that.
Oh, my God. She screwed herself over.
So that was probably my most interesting case.
Handle that psychologically, wasn't it?
I was done with her. Yeah. I mean, you know, because she had just completely used up so much of my time and energy. I mean, you throw yourself into these cases. There's another part to this story that I didn't tell you about. And you want to talk about it?
Yeah, of course.
No, not me. I'm talking to my daughter. Do you want to talk about it?
I thought you were looking behind me. So, the woman's daughter was my best friend.
Oh. Jeez. The woman's
I
daughter.
was just one of those families that I could just go for the weekend. And there was no question.
The fair was her daughter's best friend.
And that day, Samantha is her name. She said, "Come some night, you know, we just went to movie gallery, we just rented a movie, and, you know, all this stuff." And I was like, okay. My mom said no. For no reason. And
I just didn't feel like it.
So pissed. And because I don't know how old I was. I was preteen, maybe early teen. I was very pissy. And I said, why? And her and my stepdad, Peter, they both said, no. You can't go tonight. We just want to hang out with you. We'll go get dinner. I was like, that sucks. Fine. And then the next morning, Karen called and said, the mommy had shot him.
Yeah. And just the thought that my daughter could have been there really just eviscerated me.
He still lives in the same house. I still live in the same city that he does. He still lives in the same house.
Yeah.
Did you have a feeling that something was going to blow up that night, or was it just a vibe, or did you?
I don't know what it was. It was just one of those things. I was on the couch with a book and a glass of wine, and Peter was doing something on the computer, and Michelle was just like, "Mom, please, can I go to Samantha's house? Can I do this?" No, I just didn't want to be bothered. And because the thing is that they only live like a mile away from us, like as a crow flew, but it took like 20 minutes to get there because you had to drive around, you know, this meteor site or something. It was something you had to drive around. And it was just one of those nights where it was just like, I just didn't feel like going.
Wow.
I just did not feel like driving her there.
Wow.
And it was lucky. Maybe just that intuition of some sort. But it's really, I just wanted to read a book and like, cut the line. That's all. So that was probably just one of those cases, and that just always stuck with me.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
Did the husband coming in, was he armed?
Was he what?
Was the guy that was killed, was he armed?
Yes, I think he was.
Was Raymond armed?
So I think that and my memory is very, it was a little traumatizing to hear about it. Also, don't ever rent one of those little vacuum cleaner things from.
Oh.
Anyway, but I believe that he had threatened him on a phone call earlier and kept saying he was going to come kill him. And he came bursting through the door. Lonnie was ready and shot him. So he knew that it was happening. Like, he knew that the affair was happening. It was very blatantly obvious. And so I think that's why he was able to get there self-defense.
But the thing about the carpet cleaner,
The breath doctor. From the local Winn-Dixie.
about the carpet cleaner, when Karen called me at 6 o'clock that Sunday morning to ask for the name of a good criminal defense attorney, I said, oh my God, in your kitchen? You just remodeled your kitchen. And she's like, oh, and I just had that new white carpet put in the dining room, and it's all over the place. And I said, oh my God, what are you going to do? There's companies, you know. I'll find you the name of the company. The company can come and clean it. Oh, no, she said, I've already taken care of it. She said, I went down to the Winn-Dixie, which was a 24-hour grocery store, and she rented the carpet cleaner. And she used the carpet cleaner to clean up all of the blood and the brains and everything out of it.
Oh, my God.
So never rent those.
You never know where it's been.
Yeah, you don't know where it's been.
The carpet was still there?
Yeah, the carpet.
A lot of that is still there.
Yeah, well, they got, yeah, but it was just the stuff that was in the carpet cleaner. Can you imagine being the next person?
Oh, my God. What a great story of that.
Anything else? Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.